Welcome back to our next episode, episode 10, I believe this is, with Michael Horner. And today we've been looking at, if you recall, if you've been listening to other episodes, on the track record of Christianity with regard to whether it's been a net positive or net negative on culture and human history and civilization. And Michael Horner has been working us through that. And the first finding was no, it's been definitely a net positive, but there has been some ugly blemishes on the face of Christianity in history. Usually, or when people departed, actually, who claimed to be Christians or said they were, and maybe even were devout Christians, but when they departed from the teachings of Jesus. So the question always to ask is, well, is this what Jesus actually taught? But as Michael has already pointed out, it's important that we actually ask ourselves, how beneficial has Christianity been relative to what? And so now I think he wants to look at the topic of how do the irreligious do when given the chance. So welcome back, Michael. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing good. Even though I had a biopsy on my forehead, I've covered it up. It looks a little like a Frankenstein scar right now.
Oh, that's all right. I've seen worse.
Yeah.
Lucky you didn't fall off a motorcycle and use your face as the brakes on the asphalt.
Is that sounds like that's something you've had
That
experience
happened
with?
to one of the hired hands where I grew up.
Oh, okay. Not yourself. Okay.
No, not me. No, it was actually gravel road, and they had to do a lot of excavating of gravel out of his poor hide before they could send him out, patch him up, and send him out. Anyways, that's rather near nor there with regard to our topic.
You did a good job summarizing where we've come from, and after completing looking at the many of the ugly blemishes in Christian history and talking about how we deal with them. I mean, one of the points that we made is that if the people were in fact following the teachings of Christianity when they were doing these things, and it's pretty clear that they were not. They were in contradiction to the teachings of Jesus, and therefore you can't draw the conclusion that Christianity is harmful. But the other way of looking at this is to answer the question, compared to what? We've been asking that question a lot. Compared to what? And let's compare it to irreligious or non-religious impact in history. And one way to start is just to ask this question: would violence and war disappear if religion were eradicated? So let's get rid of religion. If religion's really the cause of wars and all the wars or most of the wars, you think if we just get rid of religion, violence and wars would be eradicated? Fortunately, the historical evidence doesn't seem to support that. The evidence supports the idea that, first of all, religion is not the number one cause of war. In fact, far from it. And so there's three sets of scholars that I'm looking at here. First one is Philip and Axelrod, their 3-volume Encyclopedia of Wars. They chronicle that some 1,763 wars have been waged over the course of human history. And of those wars, only 122 of them have been religious in nature. And over half of those were waged in the name of Islam. And so, and we've mentioned this in earlier episodes, this is where the figure of only 7% of all wars, therefore, have been religious, and all other religions combined apart from Islam then have caused only 3%, roughly 3 to 3.5% of all humanity's wars. I mean, just right away, that's a stark statistic.
Just to clarify, Michael, I may have missed it. I thought you said 763 wars, but you may have said 1,763.
Yeah, let me rephrase it. It's 1,763 wars, with 122 of them being religious in nature.
Never hurts to review a particular number, and I just missed the...
thanks for doing that. Clarification is always good. So another scholar that I've looked at is Andrew Holt, and he wrote a chapter in a volume called Seven Myths of Military History. His chapter was called War and the Divine: Is Religion the Cause of Most Wars? And quote, here's what he says: claims that religious wars are more violent and greater in number than other types have no empirical evidence to support them. Such arguments are wholly anecdotal, which almost certainly explains why professional historians have not embraced them. Available quantitative analyses of history's wars point in a different direction. And then he claims that religious conflicts are but a relatively modest percentage of the total, and that other causes or ideological motivations have inspired as much or more conflict than religion. Thus, he says, until new data are collected that demonstrate otherwise, the claim that religion is the greatest cause of war is an unsubstantiated myth. So, the facts are non religious motivations and naturalistic philosophies bear the blame for nearly all of history's wars. I mean, talk about turning the tables on an argument. Lives lost during religious conflicts pale in comparison to those destroyed during the regimes that wanted nothing to do with the idea of God. And this is something that R.J. Rummel's work in Lethal Politics and Death by Government has shown very clearly. Moreover, religion has played no motivating role in the major wars that have resulted in the most loss of life. Now, this is something that John Dixon, the Australian historian, focused in on. And here's what he said. He said, think of the greatest wars of history. World War I, 1914 to 1918, resulted in 15 to 20 million deaths in just 4.5 years. No one argues that this was a religious conflict. World War II, 1939-1945, led to the deaths of approximately 50 million people in 6 years. Again, no historian today suggests that religion played even a minor role in the motivations of the war. He does say, though, that it is true that both the German and the Allied forces prayed to the same God for safety, victory, and eventual peace, but this does not make these wars religious any more than we can say that they were Enlightenment wars, simply because all sides were steeped in modernity. So, in summary, here, with regard to Christianity, compared to this, there are wars before Christianity, there are wars with Christianity, there are wars without Christianity, there are wars after Christianity. Christianity is not uniquely the cause of wars. And I'm not trying to defend all religions here. I mean, I am focusing particularly on Christianity. And in our Western culture, most of the anti-religious arguments are ultimately aimed at Christianity anyway. And I'm trying to answer the question: is one justified in concluding that Christianity is harmful? And this argument that Christianity, in particular, is the cause of most wars, I just don't think legitimately leads to that conclusion.
Yeah, well, that's it's not just that's kind of understating it. I think that Christianity or even religion is the cause of most wars, and that's not true. What you've just shown here is that actually it's a minor percentage of the wars. There's a colossal difference between the number of people killed or the number of religious wars and the non-religious wars, with unfortunately, or I guess unfortunately either direction, but the non-religious reasons for war and killing vastly outweighs the religious wars.
Right. Now, I want to go into some more detail now in terms of some of the violence that's taken place. And we've mentioned in earlier episodes things like the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution. So I want to look a little bit more at those. Um, and John Dixon again helps us in this regard. Dixon says, compare the record of the Inquisition, which we've looked at in previous episodes, with the death toll of an entirely secular movement from a later period, the French Revolution, which was AD 1789 to 1799. And of course, its famous secular catch cry, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, or liberty, equality, and fraternity. It represented the triumph of the Enlightenment. So, in the name of liberty and rationality, the governing convention, elected to provide a new constitution after overthrow of the monarchy, decided that many had to die. So Dixon says, leaving aside the 200,000 killed in the civil wars and street rioting, and the approximately 10,000 who died in prison without trial, the convention sanctioned the execution of anyone who did not support the revolutionary cause. Mere suspicion was grounds for arrest, and during the so-called Reign of Terror, which was from September 1793 to July 1794, so roughly 9 months, the government arrested tens of thousands of individuals on the slightest pretext and executed many of them after a meaningless trial, says Thomas Kaiser of the University of Arkansas. The convention enforced revolutionary discipline in the provinces, often with great brutality. A de-Christianization campaign wrecked hundreds of churches and other religious sites. So, how brutal was the French Revolution in the name of liberty, equality, and the brotherhood of man? Well, we actually have news reports from the London Times that are contemporary with what was going on. Here's what the Times reported during the French Revolution. The streets of Paris, strewed with the carcasses of the mangled victims, have become so familiar to the sight that they are passed by and trod on without any particular notice. The mob think no more of killing a fellow creature, who is not even an object of suspicion, than wanton boys would of killing a cat or a dog. Are these the rights of man? The Times article asked. Is this the liberty of human nature, the so-called liberty we're talking about? Well, some 17,000 men, the newspaper reports, and women were tried and put to death during the Reign of Terror, whether by gunshot, drowning, or the newly invented guillotine. The public drowning of about 2,000 men and women in the Loire River near the town of Nantes was coldly dubbed by officials the national bath and republic baptisms. In any case, the numbers are hard to fathom. In just 9 months, the newly enlightened revolutionaries executed 3 times as many people as the Spanish Inquisition had killed in over 3 centuries. This is part of history that I think very few people in the world really are aware of, because we've been fed a different story, a different narrative. Alistair McGrath, the Christian scientist and a bit of an apologist himself, he says the French Revolution began with an outburst of energy for liberty, but by 1793 it degenerated into the Reign of Terror, in which an appeal to liberty sanctioned the most dreadful acts of violence. And many of you all know the tragic story, he says, of Madame Roland, who was brought to the guillotine on trumped-up charges, and as she was led to the guillotine, she pointed to a Statue of Liberty in the Place de Révolution and said, "Liberty, what crimes are committed in your name?" And so Dixon says those in command of the revolution, all of them Enlightenment rationalists, insisted that what they were doing was virtuous. Now, this paragraph is really important here. It insisted that what they were doing was virtuous, and that the result of this policy of terror would be a virtuous France. The great leader of the revolution at that time of the terror, who eventually was murdered himself later, Maximilien Robespierre, famously argued that terror is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, and inflexible. It is therefore an emanation of virtue. It is not so much a special principle as it is a consequence of the general principle of democracy applied to our country's most urgent needs. The terror is a disturbing reminder neither religion nor rationalism, says Dixon, is protective against the human propensity toward cruelty. So you got rid of religion, and we see what happened.
It's a jaw dropper.
It really is. It's incredible.
I guess the question comes up: why? Why did the getting rid of religion and the so-called advance of enlightenment lead to such a massive slaughter? But I think probably we're going to maybe look at that next week or next
Yeah, I
episode.
mean
Are we?
that's a crucial question and one
Yeah.
to which we're heading towards for sure.
Mhm.
But let me continue a little bit more on this because it deserves a full understanding of the horror that was taking place here. Dixon continues saying the hatred and violence of the church is utterly dwarfed by the hatred and violence of non-religious causes through history. The terror of 1793 to 1794 is such an interesting example, not because it resulted in so many unjust deaths, but because those killings were justified on holy, WHOLLY, holy secular grounds. The beheadings, shootings, and drownings were declared rational and even virtuous by a French intelligentsia that saw itself as enlightened, free from the ignorance of monarchy and church dogma. And then he adds, I wish only to highlight a fascinating historical phenomena, a paradox. While no one today rails against the ferocity of secular liberty or the viciousness of the French, a great many of us, and he says me included, have grown up decrying the legendary brutality of the Inquisition as if it epitomized all that is worst in humanity and all that is wrong with religion. But Dixon's point is that no, it's the other way around. What has happened in the absence of religion and in the name of liberty, equality, fraternity is even worse. Now, I would want to add the following that even good and noble ideas can get twisted and ultimately contribute to a worse evil than the evil they were intending to eliminate. So I want to be careful not to just point the finger at irreligion or atheism. I mean, we are doing that to a degree, but I want to acknowledge that any good idea like liberty, equality, and fraternity can so easily get twisted and contribute to or cause a greater evil than even what they were intending to eliminate. And that's what happened here. And that raises the question, well, wait a minute, why? How did that happen? And we will get there.
Mhm. Yeah, it's almost as if you could say people have a tendency, we're speaking generalities here, of course, but people have have a propensity to kill each other, but they kill each other a lot less if that is moderated by at least Christianity or religion in general, but Christianity specifically in the cases that we're looking at here, is that they will tend to kill each other, but a lot less if Christianity is being followed.
Right. So far we've just looked at the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror as sort of a counterexample here. But let's move on in history to the 20th century. It gets worse. The impact of the irreligious on war and violence throughout history staggers the imagination. As appalling as many things are that have been done in the name of religion, and even in the name of Christianity in particular, it is well documented that far more people have been murdered under non-religious and atheist regimes, in particular, in the 20th century alone, than all the casualties in all wars in all of history up to this time. Now, that's a pretty incredible statement. 20th century casualties under non-religious and atheist regimes, excuse me, is far greater than all the casualties of all wars in all of history up to this time. So let's have a look at the numbers. The number of lives lost under non-religious dictators in the 20th century alone. Now, the numbers I'm going to use here are going to be slightly conservative. They could be much, much higher. First of all, let's look at communism. Now, Rebecca McLaughlin, in her book called Confronting Christianity, has made some good points here. Just to preface what she's saying, despite the great goods that Christianity has brought to the world since Jesus' teachings were gradually but increasingly put into practice by his followers, she says, as Karl Marx surveyed Europe in the mid-19th century, he saw how far supposedly Christian countries had fallen short of the biblical promise. Religion, he wrote, is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of the heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It's the opium of the people. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for the real happiness. That's what Marx said. McLaughlin writes, the removal of religion was therefore a step on the road to justice. But Marx's dream looks like a tattered rag when held up against the violent and oppressive nightmare of communism. Marxism has been by far the bloodiest of all the worldviews in the world.
Now, that's an important point, Michael, because when we looked at, say, the actual Marxism of the 20th century, it wasn't just irreligion or maybe the absence of the religion, but in my experience, because I've been to several of these countries in the 20th century, it was actually it went beyond that. It was atheism was a requirement to. It was taught in the schools. It was a requirement to be advanced in their hierarchy of political power and so forth. It was actually an overt, intentional, anti-religious movement where they wanted to get rid of it. And in the face of that is where all this massive killing occurred.
Right. Exactly. And so Rummel, what's Rummel's first name? You know,
Rudolf
Rummel. He says the sheer numbers killed in Soviet Russia and communist China are almost impossible to digest, and we're going to look at those numbers. And he attributes them to the working out of Marxism, which I think is the point that you were making right now. So the slaughters of communism, McLaughlin says, suggest that sometimes, at least, slaying the dragon of religion can unleash a more terrible beast. So Dixon says Stalin was responsible for the deaths of 15 to 20 million people in the Soviet Union. Now, that's a very conservative number. More deaths, though, each week than the Spanish Inquisition managed to kill during 3.5 centuries. Here's what was taught during this time period to the people. Throw your bourgeois humanitarianism out of the window and act like Bolsheviks worthy of Comrade Stalin. Don't be afraid of taking extreme measures. Better to do too much than not enough.
Too much killing.
Yes.
It turned out.
Under Vladimir Lenin, there was a little over 4 million killed. And under Stalin, frankly, the numbers range from the 20 million roughly that Dixon mentioned up to 42 million. And then more recent numbers push it to 66 or 77 million even. So Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the USSR Nobel Prize winner, estimated the loss of life from state repression and terrorism in the Soviet Union from December or from 1917 to 1959 under Lenin, Stalin, and Khrushchev as about 66.7 million. Now, Rudolf Rummel, who we've both looked at, he looks at Mao Zedong in communist China. And he used to say that Mao killed about just under 38 million. But Rummel updated his numbers in 2005 to 77 million for Mao in China, after changing his mind based on others' research regarding Mao's knowledge and active starving of Chinese people that killed an additional 38 million.
Yeah, Rudolf Rummel should maybe mention he was a professor. Not sure if he's still on, maybe professor emeritus at University of Hawaii. And I think his area was political science, but his specialty was just basically killing by government. I might be narrowing it down a little bit too much, but democide is one of the terms that he used. How much does the government kill? How much have they killed? And so forth. Although he didn't limit it to that. He's actually been nominated for and actually won several very prestigious prizes for his work on genocide and mass killing.
Yeah.
In the academic world, that is.
So in speaking about the Cultural Revolution within China that Mao led, which was from 1966 to 1976, John Dixon said this revolution was designed to purge China of capitalists and traditionalists, stressed precisely Stalin's rejection of humanitarian nonsense as well. And one of Mao's many mottos was, quote, "Mercy to the enemy is cruelty to the people," which kind of has the ring of Robespierre's revolutionary policy in Paris nearly 2 century earlier, which said terror is virtue. It's amazing how twisted the morality gets when justifies this type of thinking. So we can even include Chiang Kai-shek in terms of non-religious violence and war. And then, of course, we need to add Pol Pot. This is the third atheist regime in the 20th century after Soviet Union and China. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, led by the Swiss-educated Pol Pot. He was very well educated in the West. And one of the slogans of his reign of terror says it all. 1 or 2 million young people are enough to make the new Kampuchea, the new country he was trying to form, new society. He was not quite as cruel as his adage implied. It's estimated that he killed only 2 million out of a total population of 8 million. And as Jonathan Glover writes, the regimes of Stalin and Mao killed many more people, but to kill around a quarter of the population seems like the culmination of Stalinism.
Mm-hmm. It's staggering. 1/4 of his own population.
Yeah.
Under this Marxist philosophy that he held.
During that time, towns, money, and property were abolished. Economic execution by bayonet and club was introduced for such offenses as falling asleep during the day, asking too many questions, playing non-communist music, being old and feeble, being the offspring of an undesirable, or being too well educated. So Dixon,
if you had a university degree, then it was actually a death sentence. You wanted to keep.
You were a threat.
Absolutely,
you were thinking. Yeah. So Dixon sums it up. He says the shared central project of these three regimes, the Soviet Union, China, and Cambodia, was the total redesign of society in a way unrestrained by human feelings or morality. So Rummel does his summary of the 20th century too. He says almost 170 million men, women, and children have been shot, beaten, tortured, knifed, burned, starved, frozen, crushed, or worked to death, buried alive, drowned, hung, bombed, or killed In any other of a myriad of ways, governments have inflicted death on unarmed, helpless citizens and foreigners. The dead could conceivably be nearly 360 million people. It is it is though our species has been devastated by a modern black plague. And indeed it has, but it's a plague of power, not germs. We could add in Adolf Hitler, another 21 million under a non religious regime, despite the claims that, Hitler was a Christian, which is ridiculous. He was brought up Catholic, but rejected it and manipulated the Christian church. And you look at his philosophy, it's far, far, far from the teachings of Jesus. So you can even add Hideki Tojo in Japan, and about 4 million people killed under non-religious. So what's the total? Well, maybe roughly 122 million, or it could be 138 million, or 132 million, or the highest might be about 58 million. It's hard to get it exact, but we're talking somewhere between 122 and 158 million people killed under non-religious regimes in the 20th century alone.
Now, do you recall what the total number was, let's say, for the Crusades, the witches, and the Inquisition? Do you have a rough idea what that number was?
For the Inquisitions, I remember it was about 5,000 to 6,000 over 350 years.
Mm-hmm.
Don't have numbers off the top of my head for the Crusades. The witches are a little more difficult to narrow down in the history, but again, the majority of the witch killings were done by the secular government. It wasn't the Inquisition, the church, who was doing the killing, and the witch burnings were brought to an end because the Inquisition began stomping down on it and pointing out the problems with it. And it was only 100 years after that that Enlightenment thinkers picked up on that and agreed and stopped supporting the witch burning. So it was a broader cultural movement and cause and explanation for all of that. But in terms of the numbers here, I mean, they're just they dwarf anything that took place in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, it's I worked through these Rudolph Rammel's numbers for those three things, and I can't remember the exact number anymore. Well, there is no exact number, but I mean the ballpark number. It seems to me it was somewhere around 3 million. And that was maybe, and I chose an upper end to that so that nobody could accuse me of being too conservative there. 3 million total. That was mostly in the Crusades. He had the exact number pretty much for the Inquisition, which was pretty minimal, but for the Crusades, and I think the witch burnings, witch killings, he had to do an estimate there because of the reasons you said there. But 3 million under Christianity at the most, and yet at least 122 million in the absence of Christianity. It's not even a comparison here. So the big question is, what is it about the absence of, and we're more concerned with Christianity here rather than religion in general, but what is it in the absence of religion that causes such, or that results in, the cause might be passive or active?
Yeah.
And I think that's what you're going to look at our next episode.
Yeah, because I mean, we have, admittedly, from a Christian perspective, argued that if a Christian is committing violence or starting war, they are doing so in contradiction of the teachings of Jesus, and therefore Christianity and the teachings of Christianity cannot be held responsible, or at least doesn't justify the conclusion that Christianity is harmful and therefore should be treated as harmful and marginalized and so on and so forth. But the question is, can the irreligious, can the atheist make a similar claim that, oh yeah, but they weren't really following atheism. This is a claim made by people when
Yeah.
they point out the communist numbers, right? Oh well, yeah, well that's not atheism.
Yeah.
Uh, okay, well let's consider that. Let's be fair and let's consider that. And so that's what we will look at in our next session, and I think we'll find it interesting.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Michael. This is golden. This kind of information that you've been sharing today. It really does give us something to be able to compare, religion with non-religion, and just see what the track record is. And it looks like it occurs. It really frees up people or to kill in the absence of religion for some reason. But we'll come back to that and look at it more rigorously.
I believe strongly in the idea of living not by lies.
Yeah.
Which is maybe another
Well,
way of saying what Jesus said. The truth will set you free, and
yeah.
we're trying to get to the truth here. And some of it may be uncomfortable because it challenges kind of the narrative we've been fed for quite a while. But presumably, if we can get to the truth and be honest about it, and then start asking the question, okay, what should we then do?
Mm-hmm.
How should we then think? How should we then live? How should we change in light of having more accurate information? And those are important questions.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Michael. It's been fascinating today, as it always is. You've been addressing some major cultural myths that have a lot of influence in this world, and appreciate that. So,
Yeah, I'm enjoying doing it. And thanks, Kirk, for your help. Appreciate it.
yeah. Well, bye for now. We'll see you in the next episode.